My name is Mark Torres, and this happened to me back in 1996. I still have nightmares about it. Even now, almost 30 years later, the sound of wind howling outside my window makes my hands shake. I was 45 then, working as the head of search and rescue at Mount Baker. People called me the Mountain Man because I'd saved over 100 lives on those snowy slopes. 15 years of climbing up that mountain in the worst weather you can imagine, bringing people back home to their families. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened during that blizzard. It started on a Thursday morning. I remember because I was drinking my usual coffee, black with 2 sugars, watching the snow blast against the windows of our rescue station. The weather folks were calling it the storm of the century. The wind was so strong it made the whole building creak, and you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you outside. Smart climbers know better than to be on the mountain in weather like that. That's why my stomach dropped when the phone rang. Sarah, my best team member, picked it up. I watched her face go pale as she listened. When she hung up, she just looked at me and said, "3 climbers, missing for 2 days. Last seen near the summit." I've gotten hundreds of calls like this before. Most times, we find people huddled in their tents or sheltering in a cave, cold and scared but alive. Sometimes we find them too late, but this time felt different. There was something in the air, something wrong that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I called in my best team, Sarah Chen, who could climb better than anyone half her age, Mike Ramirez, our medical expert, and John Winters, who knew the mountain's weather patterns better than he knew his own wife. We'd worked together for years, saved dozens of lives as a team. As we geared up, putting on our thermal suits and checking our rescue equipment, I had this weird feeling in my gut. You know that feeling you get when you're being watched? It was like that, but worse. Like the mountain itself was waiting for us. The helicopter couldn't fly us all the way up because of the storm. They could only drop us at the lower base camp, meaning we have to climb the rest of the way ourselves. Through the worst blizzard I'd ever seen in my life. Just another day at the office, Sarah joked as we loaded our gear, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She felt it too. Something was wrong up there. We didn't know it then, but that would be the last normal moment any of us would have. What we found up on that mountain, well, some things should stay buried in the snow. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, but I warn you, after hearing this story, you might never look at a snowy mountain the same way again. The climb up was brutal. You know how when you stick your head out of a car window, the wind makes it hard to breathe. This was 100 times worse. The snow hit our faces like tiny needles, and the wind was so loud we had to shout into our radios just to hear each other. "Stay close," I yelled to my team. We were roped together, just like we'd done 1,000 times before. In weather this bad, wandering off even a few feet could mean getting lost forever. Our headlamps barely helped. The snow was so thick it was like trying to see through a white wall. Every step had to be careful. One wrong move, and you could step right into a crack in the ice or off the edge of a cliff. 4 hours into the climb, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Mark, I think I see something." My heart jumped. Through the swirling snow, about 50 feet ahead, there was a dark shape. As we got closer, I could make out what looked like a tent. But something wasn't right. The tent was torn to shreds, like something had ripped through it from the inside out. "Mike, John, secure the perimeter," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah with me. As we got closer to the tent, my flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. Red spots in the snow. Blood. And it was frozen solid, meaning it had been there for at least a day. "No bodies," Sarah said, her voice shaking a little. "But look at their supplies. Everything's still here. Nobody abandons their gear in weather like this. Not if they have a choice." She was right. The sleeping bags, food, climbing gear, it was all there. 3 sets of everything, just like we expected. But no climbers. That's when John called out from a few feet away. "Boss, you need to see this." I walked over to where he was standing, and that's when I saw them. Tracks in the snow. But these weren't normal footprints. They were huge, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen on this mountain. And the distance between them, it was wrong. No animal I knew could make strides that long. The wind picked up again, howling around us, but this time it sounded different, almost like someone calling for help. Mike grabbed my arm. Tell me you heard that. I nodded slowly. 20 years on this mountain, and I'd never heard anything like it. The sound came again, clearer this time, a perfect imitation of a human voice calling help us. But it was coming from 3 different directions at once. Sarah pulled out her compass and frowned. Mark, the needle's spinning. That's not possible. Right then, our radios all screeched with static so loud it hurt our ears. And in that static, I could have sworn I heard laughter. The sun was setting fast, and up here, darkness isn't just dark, it's complete. We had maybe an hour of light left, and we had to make a decision. Follow those tracks, or get to safer ground and wait for morning. I looked at my team's faces, seeing my own fear reflected back at me. Whatever was up here with us, it wasn't human, and I had a terrible feeling it was hunting us. Looking back, I made the wrong choice. I decided we should follow the tracks while we still had some light. Stay together, I said. No matter what happens, we don't split up. We walked for maybe 15 minutes when the first strange thing happened. Mike was at the back of our line, and I heard him yell, "Hey, I saw someone. Over there." We all turned around. Through the falling snow, about 30 feet away, there was a dark shape that looked like a person waving. "Hello," Mike called out. "We're search and rescue." That's when Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Mark," she whispered, "look behind us." I turned around, and my heart nearly stopped. There was another figure exactly the same, waving from the opposite direction, and then another one to our left. 3 identical shapes, all waving, all looking exactly the same. "This isn't right," John said, his voice shaking. "This isn't possible." Then we heard Mike's voice coming from the shape on the right. "Help me. Over here." But Mike was standing right next to us, white as a sheet, his mouth shut tight. The wind picked up, and now it wasn't just howling, it was screaming. All 3 shapes started moving toward us at the same time. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. They looked human, but wrong. Too tall. Their arms were too long, and where their faces should have been, there was just smooth white nothing. "Run," I shouted. We turned and ran as fast as we could through the deep snow. But in the chaos, something happened. I heard John scream behind me. When I turned around, he was gone. Just gone. The only thing left was his footprints in the snow, ending in a messy splash of red. We ran until our lungs felt like they were on fire. Finally, we found a small ice cave and huddled inside. Sarah was crying silently. Mike couldn't stop shaking. Our radios were dead. Nothing but static and those horrible voice imitations coming through. "What are they?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But they're smart. They're using our voices against us, trying to separate us." "Just like they did with the other climbers," Mike said. "The torn tent, they probably called them out one by one." The temperature was dropping fast as night came. It must have been 20 below zero. Our flashlight batteries were dying. The cold kills them quick. And outside our little cave, something was walking back and forth in the snow. We could hear the crunch of its footsteps. Then we heard John's voice, clear as day. "Guys, help me. I'm hurt. Please." Sarah started to stand up, but I pulled her back down. "It's not him," I whispered. "Remember, it's not really him." The voice called again, but this time it changed halfway through. It started as John's voice, but ended in a sound I'll never forget, like ice cracking and metal scraping all mixed together. We were trapped. These things were hunting us, and as I sat there in that dark cave, listening to those things pretending to be my friend, I realized we had to do something drastic. Either we'd die from the cold, or those creatures would get us. I had one idea, but if I was wrong, it would kill us all. After what felt like hours in that cave, I noticed something important. Every time these creatures appeared, the snow got worse, and when they mimicked our voices, the wind would pick up like crazy. That's when it hit me. Maybe they weren't just in the storm. Maybe they were part of it. "I have a plan," I whispered to Sarah and Mike, "but it's dangerous, really dangerous." "Anything's better than freezing to death in here," Mike said. I pulled out my last emergency flare and the small avalanche charges we carry for clearing dangerous snow builds. These things, I explained, they're using the storm to hunt, so maybe we can use the mountain against them. Sarah caught on quick. The ridge above us, if we could trigger an avalanche, we'd bury them, Mike finished. But Mark, we'd probably get buried too. I nodded. I know. But we're running out of options. Just then, we heard something that made us freeze. Multiple voices, some sounding like John, others like people I'd never heard before, all calling out at once. And they were getting closer. They're coming, Sarah whispered. We had to move fast. We left the cave, and I almost wished we hadn't. In the dim light of our dying flashlights, we could see them. There must have been 6 or 7 of those things, all tall and white, moving through the snow like they were floating. They were hurting us, trying to push us toward the cliff edge. We ran toward the ridge instead. The creatures followed, still calling out with stolen voices. My legs were burning from trudging through the deep snow, but pure fear kept me going. When we reached the ridge, I could feel the unstable snow under our feet. Perfect for what we needed to do. When I say run, I told Sarah and Mike, head for that group of rocks. I pointed to a cluster of large boulders sticking out of the snow about 50 yards away. They're too big to get buried. It's our only chance. The creatures were getting closer. They seemed to realize something was wrong because they stopped mimicking voices. Instead, they made this awful screeching sound that made my head hurt. Now, I screamed. As Sarah and Mike ran for the rocks, I lit the flare. The bright red light seemed to confuse the creatures for a second. They backed away from it, and that's when I threw the avalanche charges. The explosion wasn't very big, but it was enough. There was this deep cracking sound, like the whole mountain was splitting open. The creatures screamed, not with stolen voices now, but with their real ones. It was the most horrible sound I've ever heard. The snow started sliding, slowed at first, then faster and faster. I ran as hard as I could toward the rocks where Sarah and Mike were hiding. The avalanche was right behind me, and so were those things, their long arms reaching for me. I felt something grab my leg just as I dove behind the rocks. I kicked hard and scrambled up next to Sarah and Mike. We held onto each other and the rocks as the avalanche roared past us like a white tornado. The creatures' screams got fainter and fainter as the snow carried them down the mountain. Then everything went quiet except for the normal howling of the wind. We stayed there until morning, shivering and scared to move. When the sun finally came up, the storm was gone. The mountain looked normal again, like nothing had ever happened. Search and rescue found us later that day. We told them we got caught in an avalanche trying to find the missing climbers. What else could we say? Who would believe the truth? They never found John's body, or the 3 missing climbers, or anything else. Sometimes on really cold nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear voices calling for help outside my window. And I always keep my doors locked during snowstorms. That was 28 years ago. I retired from search and rescue right after that mission. Some nights I still wake up hearing those voices, those terrible copies of human sounds. Sarah quit too. Mike stayed on for another year before moving to Florida. He said he never wanted to see snow again. I thought it was over. I really did, until last week. I was sitting at home, watching the news when a story caught my attention. They were talking about how Mount Baker's glaciers are melting faster than ever because of climate change. But that's not what scared me. It was what they found in the melting ice. A camera crew was up there filming a story about the melting glaciers when they discovered something. The reporter was talking about how the ice was revealing things that had been frozen for decades. Old climbing gear, lost backpacks, that sort of stuff. Then they showed it, a gloved hand sticking out of the ice. They thought it might belong to one of the climbers who went missing back in '96. But that's not what made my coffee mug slip from my hands and shatter on the floor. It was what they showed next. In the fresh mud where the ice had melted, they found tracks. The reporter called them unexplained and unusual. She held up a ruler next to one of them. The stride length between prints was impossibly long. My phone rang right after the news story. It was Sarah. She'd seen it too. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "The ice, it's melting." I know, I replied. They can't dig up there, she whispered. They can't disturb that ice. What if we didn't bury them deep enough? I looked out my window. Even though it was a warm spring day, I felt cold all over because I knew she was right. Those things weren't dead. They were just frozen, waiting. Last night, the weather report said we're having the warmest spring on record. The glaciers are melting faster than ever. And yesterday, 3 hikers went missing on Mount Baker. I can hear the wind picking up outside my window now. It almost sounds like it's calling my name. But that's crazy, right? Right? My name is Emily Sullivan, and this happened to me back in 1967 when I was working as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I was only 26 then, fresh-faced and excited about my job. I loved everything about being a ranger: the smell of pine trees in the morning, the sight of elk grazing in meadows, and even the tourist questions about where bears might be hiding. But what happened that winter changed everything. It started with the weather. November brought the coldest temperatures I'd ever seen in my 3 years at the park. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache and turns your breath into little white clouds that hang in the air. Most of the tourists had gone home, leaving the park quiet and empty. That's how I liked it best, actually. Just me, my small team of 4 other rangers, and the wilderness. The first sign that something was wrong came when Tom, our senior ranger, reported some strange noises on his radio during night patrol. Not the usual wolf howls or elk calls we were used to. This was different, like a high-pitched humming that would come and go. We joked that maybe he was picking up signals from space aliens. If only we'd known then how much we'd wish it was just aliens. Then the animals started acting weird. The elk herds, which normally stayed in the valley during winter, began moving to higher ground despite the heavy snow. Bears that should have been hibernating were seen wandering around looking scared. And nothing scares a grizzly bear. Something was spooking them, but we couldn't figure out what. I remember sitting in my cabin one night, writing up my daily report, when I got the call that would start this whole nightmare. Jamie, our newest ranger, was almost screaming into his radio. He found something out near Crystal Creek, something that made his voice shake like I'd never heard before. Emily, you need to see this, he said. I don't even know how to describe it. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and my trusty rifle, and headed out into the darkness. I had no idea I was about to discover something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about nature, about science, and about what might be hiding in the dark corners of our world. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my way to Crystal Creek. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, making scary shapes out of tree branches. Jamie was waiting for me at the edge of a small clearing, and I could see right away that something was very wrong. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he held his own flashlight. Over there, he whispered, pointing to something in the snow. I've never seen anything like it, Emily. What I saw made my stomach turn. There was an elk lying in the snow, but this wasn't like any animal death I'd seen before, and I'd seen plenty in my years as a ranger. The elk looked like it had been operated on. That's the only way I can describe it. The cuts were perfectly straight, like someone had used a surgeon's knife. There was no blood in the snow, which made no sense at all. Even stranger, there were no tracks around the body except for Jamie's boots. How was this possible? I heard myself say. My voice sounded small in the cold night air. No wolf or bear could do this. And where are the tracks? Jamie shook his head. That's not even the weirdest part. Listen. We stood perfectly still. Usually at night, you'd hear all sorts of sounds. Owls hooting, small animals moving through the underbrush, the wind in the trees. But there was nothing. Complete silence. Like every living thing had run away. I reached for my radio to call Tom. This was way above my pay grade. But when I pressed the button, all I got was that strange humming noise Tom had mentioned earlier. It made my teeth feel weird, like when you bite on aluminum foil. We need to document this, I said, trying to stay calm even though my heart was racing. I took out my camera and started taking pictures. The flash lit up the clearing in quick bursts, making everything look even creepier than it already was. That's when we saw it, just for a second, in one of the camera flashes. Something moved at the edge of the trees. Something tall. Something that definitely wasn't a bear. Jamie saw it too. I could tell because he grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Emily, he whispered, I don't think we're alone out here. We backed away slowly, our eyes fixed on the tree line. The humming on my radio got louder, and then it changed. Started to sound almost like it had a pattern to it, like it was responding to our movements. Run, I said quietly. Back to the truck. Now, we didn't look back. We just ran, the sound of our own breathing and pounding feet the only thing breaking that horrible silence. When we finally reached the truck, we jumped in and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a shadow moving differently than shadows should. That was the moment I knew our peaceful life in Yellowstone was over. Something was hunting in our park. Something that didn't belong here. Something that knew how to hunt in ways nature never intended. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting at the ranger station. All 5 of us gathered around the old wooden table. Me, Jamie, Tom, Sarah, and Mike. The coffee in our mugs had gone cold while we looked at the photos from last night. Nobody wanted to be the first to say what we were all thinking. This wasn't normal. I've been looking at the old park maps, Sarah said, spreading out a faded paper on the table. She was our best tracker and knew Yellowstone like the back of her hand. There's something interesting. About 2 miles from where you found the elk, there's a building that's not on any of our current maps. Tom leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. That's weird. I've been here 15 years and never heard of any building out there. We decided to check it out. All of us went. Nobody wanted to be left behind after what Jamie and I had seen. The walk took about an hour, and with each step, that weird feeling in my stomach got worse. The forest was still too quiet. Then we saw it through the trees. A concrete building, gray and ugly against the beautiful forest. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Vines grew up the walls, and some of the windows were broken. Above the rusty metal door, I could just make out some faded letters. Wildlife Research Station Number 7. Look at this, Mike called out. He was examining the door. The lock's been broken recently. Someone's been here. Inside, the air smelled musty and wrong, like old chemicals. Our flashlight beams showed empty halls and rooms full of dusty equipment. Old papers were scattered everywhere. Something about this place made my skin crawl. In what looked like an office, we found a filing cabinet that wasn't completely rusted shut. Inside were folders marked classified in red letters. My hands shook as I opened one. Guys, I said, my voice barely a whisper, these are from 1962. They were doing experiments here. On the animals. The documents talked about testing something called frequency response in large mammals. There were pictures that made me feel sick. Animals with weird devices attached to them. Notes about how they reacted to different radio signals. Then Sarah's voice came from another room, sounding scared. Emily, you need to see this. We hurried over. She was standing in front of a large metal door marked Lab 3. It was dented outward, like something inside had tried to break out. That's when our radios all started humming at once, louder than ever before. The sound made my head hurt. Through the noise, I heard Mike say something that made my blood run cold. Do you hear that? There's something moving in the halls behind us. We'd all turned around slowly, flashlights pointing back the way we'd come. The humming got louder, and in the beam of my light, I saw something that shouldn't exist. A shadow that moved like water, but standing upright, and it was coming toward us. Everything happened so fast after that. We ran, all 5 of us, through the dark hallways of that horrible building. The humming from our radios got so loud I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't while running. Behind us, something was moving, something fast. Mike was the first one we lost. He was at the back of our group, and suddenly his flashlight beams started dancing wildly on the walls. I heard him yell, "It's got me," then silence. Sarah tried to go back for him, but Tom grabbed her arm. "We can't," he said, his voice breaking. "We have to keep moving." We found a storage room and locked ourselves inside. Everyone was breathing hard, trying not to make noise. In the light of our flashlights, I could see tears running down Sarah's face. "What do we do?" Jamie whispered. What was that thing? I pulled out the papers I'd stuffed in my jacket when we ran. With shaking hands, I started reading through them. Listen to this, I said quietly. In 1962, they were testing ways to control animals using radio waves. They wanted to see if they could make animals move where they wanted by using special frequencies. I swallowed hard. But something went wrong. The frequency started changing the animals somehow, making them different. A loud crash from somewhere in the building made us all jump. Sarah's radio crackled to life, but instead of normal static, it made a sound like metal scraping on metal. Tom reached for his radio to call for help. Before I could stop him, the thing burst through the ceiling tiles above him. I only saw it for a second, like a shadow made solid, with long arms that weren't quite arms. Tom disappeared into the darkness above, his scream cut short. "The radios," I shouted. "It's using them to find us. Turn them off." Jamie and Sarah fumbled with their radios, switching them off, but it was too late for Sarah. As she reached for her radio, something dark wrapped around her waist and pulled her into the darkness. Her flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning and throwing crazy shadows on the walls. Now it was just me and Jamie, pressed against the wall, watching the darkness. Our flashlight batteries were starting to die, making the beams weaker and weaker. "Emily," Jamie whispered, "if we don't make it, I found something else in the files." They powered everything from a main generator in the basement. All their experiments, all the frequencies. He never finished. The thing moved like lightning, wrapping around him like black smoke. I reached for him, but my hands grabbed nothing but air. His flashlight fell, and then I was alone in the storage room, my dying flashlight the only thing between me and the darkness. I could hear it moving around outside the room, scraping against the walls, waiting, hunting, and I knew what I had to do. The generator in the basement, if I could destroy it, maybe I could stop this thing. Maybe I could end what those scientists started all those years ago. Taking a deep breath, I got ready to make a run for it. I had one chance, and I couldn't waste it. My friends were gone, but maybe I could make sure this thing never hurt anyone else. I waited until the scraping sounds moved away from the door. My flashlight was barely working now, giving off just enough light to see a few feet ahead. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the old papers one last time, trying to find anything that could help me. Then I saw it, a page marked Emergency Protocols. The scientists had known something could go wrong. They'd built a fail-safe into the generator system. If the power surged too high, everything would shut down. But to make that happen, someone would have to overload it manually. Someone would have to be in the basement with it. The basement. The thought made my stomach turn. But I knew what my friends would want me to do. I took a deep breath and opened the door as quietly as I could. The hallway was pitch black except for my dying flashlight beam. The air felt thick, like breathing through a wet blanket. That's when I noticed something. The colder it got, the stronger that humming sound became. The creature needed the cold to move around. The basement stairs were at the end of the hall. Each step down felt like walking deeper into a nightmare. The humming got louder with every step. My flashlight caught something shiny on the wall, an old thermometer. It read 15 degrees. No wonder the thing was so active down here. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, the generator. It was huge, filling most of the room with old machinery. Dials and buttons covered its front, and thick cables ran from it into the walls. This was what gave the creature its power. This was what I had to destroy. But I wasn't alone. My flashlight caught movement in the corner, that familiar shadow shape, but bigger than before. It had followed me down here. In the weak light, I could almost see a face in it. Not a human face, but something that might have been an animal once, before the experiments changed it. The thing moved closer. The humming from the generator got so loud it felt like my head would split open. I backed up against the control panel, feeling the vibrations through my jacket. The creature raised what might have been an arm, reaching for me. That's when I understood what I had to do. The generator wasn't just powering the building, it was powering the creature itself. Those frequencies had changed it so much that it needed them to exist. And I knew how to end this, once and for all. I turned to the control panel, my hands moving to the dials. Behind me, I could feel the cold getting stronger as the thing got closer. My fingers found the power controls. I knew what turning them all the way up would mean. I knew I probably wouldn't make it out. But sometimes being brave means being scared and doing the right thing anyway. This is for my friends, I whispered and started turning the dials. The generator started making a sound I'd never heard before, like a huge engine revving up way too fast. The lights in the basement started flickering wildly. I could feel the heat coming off the machine as I turned the last dial all the way up. The creature knew what I was doing. It lunged at me, its cold shadow body reaching out. I felt its icy touch on my arm, and it was like being dumped in frozen water. But I held on to the controls. I couldn't let go now. "Come on," I said through chattering teeth. "Just a little more." The generator was shaking now. Sparks flew from its sides. The humming turned into a high-pitched screech that made my ears hurt. The creature pulled at me harder, trying to stop what was happening, but it was too late. The temperature in the room started rising as the generator overheated. The creature's grip on my arm weakened. It was having trouble keeping its shape in the heat. That's when I saw something amazing. In the flickering light, I could see through its shadow body. Inside, there were shapes moving, like memories of all the animals it had taken, trying to break free. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from inside the generator. Warning lights started flashing everywhere. The creature let go of me completely, backing away from the heat. It made a sound, not quite an animal noise, not quite human, somewhere between a scream and static on a radio. "It's over," I told it, even as my vision started getting blurry from the heat and smoke. No more hunting, no more killing. The generator exploded. I remember a flash of light brighter than anything I'd ever seen. I remember heat and noise, and then nothing. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Montana. They told me search and rescue had found me in the snow outside the research station. The building had collapsed in on itself, burying everything in the basement. They never found my friends' bodies. They also told me something else. Every piece of electronic equipment within a mile of that building had burned out that night. Radios, cameras, everything. Like something had sucked up all the electrical power in the area and then just disappeared. That was 57 years ago. I'm an old woman now, but I still work as a park guide sometimes, telling people about Yellowstone's history. Of course, I don't tell them this story. Who would believe it? But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind is blowing just right, I think I hear that humming sound again, very faint and far away. When that happens, I turn off my radio just to be safe. And I remember my friends who gave their lives to stop something terrible. I also remember what we learned that night, that there are things in this world we don't understand. Things that science can create but can't control. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is face those things, even when we're scared. The Park Service built new trails away from where the research station used to be. Nature has taken back that area now, trees and bushes growing over the concrete ruins. But if you look carefully, you can still see bits of old metal poking through the ground. And in winter, they say nothing ever grows in that spot where the generator room used to be. Just an empty circle of cold ground, as if something there is still hungry for warmth. My name is James Blackwood, and this happened to me in 1932, during the worst days of the Dust Bowl. I need to write this down while I still can. Maybe someone will find it and understand why I did what I had to do. More importantly, they'll know what's still out there, slowly digging its way back to the surface. I was a park ranger back then, watching over a stretch of canyons and dusty plains in the Oklahoma Territory. Those were hard times, the kind that stick to your bones like the dust that covered everything. Farmers were leaving their homes in droves, trying to escape the endless drought and dust storms that had turned our once green land into something that looked more like the moon. But it wasn't just the dust driving people away from Echo Canyon. People were disappearing, not just moving away, vanishing. At first, I thought they just packed up in the night, like so many others. But then I started finding the empty houses. They didn't look right. Plates of half-eaten food on tables. Clothes still hanging on lines. Doors left wide open, like the families had just walked out in the middle of whatever they were doing. The strangest part was the markings. Every abandoned house had them, deep scratches in the walls, both inside and out. They weren't random either. They made patterns like some kind of twisted writing. I'd been a ranger for 12 years, and I'd seen what bears and mountain lions could do. This was different. I remember standing in one of those houses, dust floating in the sunbeams coming through the windows. Little Sally Jenkins' doll was still sitting at the kitchen table, next to a moldy bowl of cornmeal mush. The Jenkins family, mom, dad, and 3 kids, had been gone for 2 weeks by then. Their car was still in the barn. Their horses were still in the pasture, scared of something I couldn't see. That's when old Joseph from the Cherokee settlement up north came to my station. He was in his 70s, with deep lines in his face and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't waste time with small talk. The hunger is awake again, he told me, his voice shaking. It sleeps for many years, then comes back when people are weak and scared. Your people didn't listen when my grandfather warned them not to build in Echo Canyon. Now it's too late. I didn't want to believe him. But after what I'd seen in those houses, after the nightmares I'd been having about those strange marks on the walls, I knew I had to do something. So I put together a search party. 5 good men, all local folks who knew the land. We had rifles, lanterns, and enough supplies for a week. Looking back, I realized how unprepared we really were. We had no idea what was waiting for us in those canyons. No idea at all. We started our search on a Tuesday morning. The sky was a dirty brown color, like it always was back then, and the wind kept blowing dust in our faces. Our group spread out a bit, but stayed close enough to see each other. Mike Thompson led the way. He'd been hunting these canyons since he was a boy. Behind him were the Miller brothers, Tom and John, then Pete Carson and Bill Hayes bringing up the rear. I kept in the middle, checking my compass every now and then to make sure we didn't get turned around in the maze of rock walls. The first strange thing we noticed was the silence. Usually, you'd hear birds or wind in the trees, or at least crickets. But there was nothing. Even our boots on the rocky ground seemed too loud, like we were walking in church. "James," Mike called out softly around noon. "Come look at this." He was kneeling next to a rock wall, his hand hovering over more of those weird scratches I'd seen in the houses. But these were fresh. The rock dust was still scattered on the ground below them. "Something made these today," he said, looking up at me with worried eyes. "Something big." I measured the marks with my hand. They were as long as my forearm and deep enough that I could put my finger inside them. Whatever made them had to be powerful, more powerful than any animal I knew of. We found more signs as we went deeper into the canyon. Torn up bushes, scattered bones that didn't look like animal bones. And everywhere, those strange scratches like something was writing messages we couldn't read. As the sun started to set, Bill suggested we make camp in a wide spot where we could see in all directions. Nobody argued. We built a fire, but it didn't seem to push back the darkness like it should have. The shadows between the rocks looked darker than normal, like pools of ink. We took turns keeping watch. I had the second shift. Right around midnight, the fire had burned low, and the quarter moon cast weird shadows on the canyon walls. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It was like rocks grinding together, but with something else mixed in. Something that sounded almost like words, but not in any language I'd ever heard. It echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I woke the others as quietly as I could. We all sat there, rifles ready, listening to that awful sound get closer, then farther away, then closer again. Pete was shaking so bad I could hear his rifle rattling against his belt buckle. Then Tom Miller whispered, "Look at the shadows." We all saw it. The shadows on the canyon wall were moving wrong. They weren't following the fire's light like they should. They were moving on their own, stretching and shrinking like something alive. That's when Bill screamed. We spun around, but he was already gone, just gone, like someone had erased him from the world. His rifle clattered to the ground where he'd been standing. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, and in response, that grinding noise got louder, much louder. And it was coming from right above us. Nobody slept after Bill disappeared. We huddled together, backs against a rock wall, watching the darkness. The grinding sound moved around us all night, sometimes so close we could feel vibrations in the ground. When the sun finally came up, we found fresh scratches all around our camp, even on the rocks right above where we'd been sitting. "We need to find Bill," Tom Miller said, but his voice shook. We all knew we probably wouldn't find him alive. Following the scratches on the rocks, we came to the mouth of a cave. The entrance was huge, like a giant mouth in the canyon wall. The air coming out of it smelled wrong, like old meat left too long in the sun. "I hear something," Pete whispered. Like someone crying?" He was right. From deep in the cave came sounds that might have been crying, or might have been laughter. It was hard to tell with the echo. Mike pointed his flashlight into the darkness. The beam showed more scratches covering the cave walls, floor to ceiling, but these weren't fresh. Some looked ancient, with edges worn smooth by time. Generations of those strange marks, all telling some story we couldn't understand. That's when my flashlight beam caught something that made my heart stop. A shoe. Then another. Then piles of clothes, scattered watches, wedding rings. Years' worth of belongings from all the people who'd gone missing. Decades of them. "Oh God," John Miller breathed. "Look up." We all pointed our lights at the cave ceiling. I wish we hadn't. Hanging there, wrapped in what looked like gray spider webs, were bundles. Human-shaped bundles. Some were old, just bones wrapped in dusty cocoons. Others were fresher. One of them was wearing Bill's red flannel shirt. The crying sound got louder. No, not crying. It was that thing, making sounds that almost seemed human. Trying to trick us, like a cat meowing to attract birds. "Run," I whispered. "Run now." We turned to flee, but Pete tripped over a pile of old bones. As he fell, our lights caught something moving on the cave ceiling. Something big. In the jumping flashlight beams, I saw gray skin that looked like rock, too many legs, and eyes. So many eyes. Glowing like drops of copper in the dark. It moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. 1 second Pete was scrambling to his feet. The next he was just gone. Pulled into the darkness so fast he didn't even have time to scream. The rest of us ran. We ran like scared rabbits, dropping our equipment, not caring which way we went as long as it was away from that cave. The grinding sound followed us, bouncing off the canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Mike was the next to disappear. 1 minute he was running beside me, the next there was just empty air where he'd been. Then John Miller. It grabbed him right in front of me. A huge gray limb like a cross between a spider's leg and a stone column shot out of a shadow and wrapped around him. The sound he made, I'll never forget that sound. Only Tom and I were left now, running blind in the early morning light. And somewhere behind us, that thing was coming, following our movement, following our sound, following us home. Tom and I ran until our legs gave out. We ended up hiding in a narrow crack between two rocks, trying to catch our breath. That's when I remembered what old Joseph had said about the creature being drawn to sound and movement. All those scratches on the walls, they weren't writing. They were from it feeling its way around, hunting by touch and vibration like a spider in its web. "We need to get back to town," Tom whispered. "Warn everyone." I shook my head. "It'll follow us. That's why all those families disappeared completely. It didn't want anyone left to warn others." The grinding noise was getting closer again. I could feel small rocks shifting under my feet as something massive moved nearby. Tom pressed himself deeper into our hiding spot, but I was watching the shadows on the canyon walls. They were moving wrong again. Then I saw it clearly for the first time in the morning light. It was like someone had taken parts from a spider, a crab, and the canyon rocks themselves and mixed them all together. Its gray body blended perfectly with the stone walls. As it moved, parts of it looked solid as rock, while other parts flowed like sand. Those copper-colored eyes were scattered across its body, each one moving on its own, searching. That's when I noticed something else. The cave we found wasn't just its lair, it was part of a whole network of tunnels. This thing had been down there for who knows how long, digging through the rock, making the canyon into one big trap. But if it had dug those tunnels— "Tom," I whispered, "I have an idea. But you need to get out of here. Get to my station. There's dynamite in the storage shed." "What are you going to do?" "Something stupid. When you hear me shout, light that dynamite and throw it into any cave entrance you can find." As many sticks as you can light. Understand? He nodded, though I could see he was scared to death. I waited until the creature's grinding sound moved away a little, then pushed Tom toward the wider part of the canyon. Run. Don't stop until you get there. After he left, I picked up a rock and threw it as hard as I could against the canyon wall. The sound echoed like a gunshot. All those copper eyes turned toward me at once. That's right, I said, picking up another rock. Come and get me. I ran straight for the cave where we first seen it. Behind me, I could hear it coming fast, its rock-like legs scraping against the canyon walls. I threw rocks as I ran, making as much noise as I could. I needed it angry. I needed it focused only on me. The cave entrance was right ahead now. I could smell that awful rotting smell again. Behind me, the grinding sound was so close it made my teeth hurt. I felt something brush against my back, one of those giant legs just missing me. I ran deeper into the cave, into the darkness. Everything now depended on Tom, and whether he'd understood what I wanted him to do. The creature was right behind me, its body almost filling the tunnel. There was no way to turn back now. I just hoped I was right about what would happen next. I ran deeper and deeper into the darkness, using my flashlight's beam to find my way. The tunnels twisted and turned like a snake's path. Every few seconds, I'd shout or throw another rock, making sure the creature stayed focused on me. The grinding sound was so close now I could feel its vibrations in my bones. My flashlight caught more of those horrible bundles hanging from the ceiling. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All those missing people. But I couldn't think about that now. I had to keep running, had to get as deep into these tunnels as I could. Then I saw exactly what I'd been hoping for, a place where several tunnels came together in a big cave room. The ceiling here was cracked, with little streams of dirt falling down whenever the creature moved. The whole place looked unstable, ready to come down with just the right push. Tom! I screamed as loud as I could. Now. The creature lunged at me. One of its legs caught my shoulder, spinning me around. The pain was horrible, like being hit with a burning rock. I fell and my flashlight rolled away, its beam showing me more of those copper eyes, getting closer and closer. Then I heard it, the first explosion. It sounded far away, but the whole cave shook. Dirt and small rocks rained down from the ceiling. The creature pulled back, confused by the vibrations coming from all directions. Another explosion, closer this time. The creature's legs scraped against the rock walls as it turned around, trying to figure out what was happening. More dirt fell, then bigger rocks. A third explosion, and this time I could feel it through the ground. Parts of the ceiling started coming down. The creature made a sound I hadn't heard before, something between a screech and the sound of rocks being crushed. I got to my feet and started to run, but one of those huge legs caught me again, wrapping around my waist. The pain was unbearable. Through tear-filled eyes, I saw those copper eyes all turning to look at me. That's when the biggest explosion came. The ceiling didn't just fall, it collapsed completely. Huge rocks crashed down all around us. The creature's grip on me loosened as it tried to avoid the falling rocks. I pulled free and ran for the tunnel I'd come through. But I only made it a few steps before something hit my head. Everything went dark after that. I woke up hours later, buried up to my chest in dirt and rocks. My flashlight was still on, somehow, wedged between some rocks and pointing at the ceiling, or what used to be the ceiling. Now there was just a solid wall of collapsed rock behind me. It took me 2 hours to dig myself out, and another 3 to crawl back to the cave entrance. Tom was there with the rescue party. They'd been afraid to come in after the cave-in, thinking I was dead for sure. I spent 2 months in the hospital after that. My shoulder never did heal right, and sometimes I still feel those rock-hard legs squeezing me in my nightmares. But we thought it was over. We thought we won. Then yesterday, I picked up a strange sound on my radio. At first, I thought it was just static, but then I recognized it. That grinding noise, faint but getting stronger. It's coming from deep underground. You see, we didn't kill it. We just trapped it. And now, 2 years later, I can hear it down there slowly digging its way out. That's why I'm writing this all down. Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to be ready. Because it's patient, it's strong, and it's still hungry. If you're reading this and you hear grinding sounds in the night, or see strange scratches on your walls, or notice shadows moving in ways they shouldn't, run. Run as far as you can. It's coming back. And this time, I won't be here to stop it. My name is Kate Martinez, and this happened to me last October. I still have trouble sleeping when I think about it, but I need to share what happened out there in the Blackwood Forest. Maybe writing it down will help make sense of things. Maybe it won't, but people need to know. I was a ranger for 12 years at Blackwood National Park. Good at my job, too. Me and my German Shepherd Max had the best rescue record in the district. Max was more than just my partner. He was my best friend for 8 years. We've been through everything together, from lost hikers to wild animal attacks. He never failed me. Not once. Until that night. It started like any other emergency call. I was doing paperwork in my cabin when the alert came in, an emergency beacon going off deep in the woods. Nothing too unusual about that. Hikers get lost all the time, especially in October when the weather starts turning and the sun sets earlier. I remember checking my watch, 6:43 p.m. The sun would be setting in less than an hour. I grabbed my gear and whistled for Max. He was always excited for a rescue, tail wagging like crazy as he jumped into my truck. I called in backup too. Rangers Tom and Sarah from the next station over. They said they'd meet me there in about 40 minutes. The drive to the beacon's location took us down Old Pine Trail, one of the less used paths in the park. Something felt it off right from the start. The birds had gone quiet. You know how the forest gets sometimes, when everything just stops? It was like that, but worse. Even Max seemed tense, and he was usually such a happy boy. I kept telling myself it was just another rescue, just another day of work. God, I wish I'd listened to that feeling in my gut that told me to turn back. But I didn't. Instead, I parked at the trailhead, clipped on Max's search vest, and headed into the woods with my flashlight ready. The sun was already starting to set, painting the trees in shades of orange and red. Beautiful, really. That's the thing about horror. It always starts with something beautiful. Little did I know that this would be the last normal moment of my life. The last time I'd see Max as the happy, tail-wagging partner I'd known for 8 years. The last time I'd feel whole. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what we found at that campsite and how everything went terribly, terribly wrong. The emergency beacon signal led us about 2 miles into the woods. Max kept close to my side, which was weird. He usually ran ahead on trails he knew so well. But that night, he stayed right next to my leg, like he was afraid to leave me. I kept having to check my phone to make sure we were going the right way because honestly, everything looked different in the fading light. Then we found the campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was still standing, but something was wrong. It wasn't torn or broken, it just looked empty. Like someone had deflated it from the inside. Their backpacks were there, open but not ransacked. A pot of half-cooked pasta sat on a portable stove, the water now cold and mushy. It was like the campers had just vanished in the middle of making dinner. That's when I noticed the trees. At first, I thought someone had carved their initials, like teenagers do. But these weren't initials. They were strange symbols I'd never seen before, carved deep into the bark of every tree around the campsite. They looked fresh. The wood underneath was still light-colored and damp. I counted 12 trees, each with the same weird mark, like a spiral with little lines coming out of it. I came my radio. Base, this is Ranger Martinez. I'm at the beacon location. No sign of campers, but I stopped talking when I heard something crack in the woods behind me. Max's ears perked up. He started growling, not his usual alert bark, but a low, frightened sound I'd never heard him make before. His tail was tucked between his legs. "Hello," I called out, shining my flashlight into the trees. "This is Park Ranger Martinez. If anyone can hear me, please respond." The forest answered with silence, that awful heavy silence that makes your skin crawl. I pulled out my notebook and started writing down what I saw, trying to stay calm and professional. That's when my radio crackled. Tom and Sarah were close, maybe 10 minutes away. I felt relieved knowing they were coming. Safety in numbers, right? While waiting, I checked the camping permit attached to the tent. It belonged to the Cooper family, mom, dad, and two teenage kids. They'd arrived yesterday morning for a weekend trip. Everything was normal in their paperwork. Everything except I froze as I read the last line of their permit. Under pets, they listed one golden retriever, Lucy. Right then, somewhere in the darkness, I heard a dog bark. It sounded exactly like a golden retriever. Max whimpered and pressed himself against my legs. He was shaking. And that's when I remembered something. The Cooper's car wasn't in the parking lot when I'd arrived. There shouldn't be any dogs out here at all. Something wasn't adding up, and I needed answers fast. I got on my radio again, this time calling the main office. Jenny, I need you to check something for me. Has anyone reported a missing golden retriever recently, or any missing pets at all? Jenny's voice came back scratchy through the radio. Let me look. Oh, that's strange. We've had several reports over the years, all from this same area. Mostly dogs, some cats. The weird thing is, they're all spread out, one or two cases, every few years going back to the 1980s. My hands felt cold despite the warm night. I clicked through my flashlight's photos of the previous ranger reports on my phone. How had I never noticed this pattern before? Every few years, like clockwork, pets would go missing in this part of the forest. And now there was that golden retriever bark echoing through the trees. Max suddenly jerked his head up. His whole body went stiff. In the distance, we heard it again, a dog barking. But this time it wasn't just any bark. It was Max's bark. His exact bark. The special one he used when he found someone during a rescue. But Max was right here beside me, trembling. The fake bark came again, closer this time. Then another joined it, the golden retriever from before. Then another and another. Soon the woods were filled with different dog barks, all coming from different directions. I shone my flashlight around, but the beams just showed empty trees with those creepy symbols. Tom, Sarah, where are you guys? I called into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. Static was my only answer. That's when Max did something he'd never done before. He growled at me. His ears were flat against his head, and he was backing away, still growling. I reached for him, confused and scared. Max, buddy, what's wrong? He took another step back, then turned and ran into the darkness. Max, I shouted, starting to run after him. Max, come back. I heard him bark once, his real bark, scared and far away. Then silence. Just awful silence and those other barks, getting closer and closer. My radio crackled. Kate, it was Tom's voice. We're nearby. We can hear dogs barking. Are you running some kind of search? Tom, listen to me, I said into the radio, my voice shaking. Those aren't real dogs. Whatever you do, don't follow the barking. Meet me at the campsite, now. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, I heard Tom's voice again, not from the radio this time, but from somewhere in the woods. Kate, is that you? I think I found your dog. I knew it wasn't really Tom's voice. I knew it couldn't be, but it sounded exactly like him. Tom. Sarah's real voice came through my radio. Kate, I can hear Tom calling for help. I'm going to check. Sarah, no. I screamed into my radio. That's not Tom. Stay where you are. But her radio had gone silent. Now I could hear her voice too, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Kate? Oh God, Kate, help me. I knew I shouldn't follow the voices. I knew they weren't real. But these were my friends, my teammates. And somewhere out there was Max. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight. Then I heard Max whimpering, a sound that broke my heart. He sounded hurt, scared. The whimper came from behind a large oak tree, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. Max, I whispered, taking a step forward. The whimpering got louder. I moved closer, my flashlight showing more of those strange symbols carved into the tree trunk. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The air turned cold, and my breath came out in little white puffs. That's when I saw it. Not Max, not anything that should exist. It was like a shadow standing upright, but darker than dark, where its face should have been. There were just swirls of blackness, like smoke underwater, and it was making Max whimpers perfectly, like playing a recording through a speaker. I tried to run. I really did. But my legs wouldn't move. The thing reached out with what looked like an arm made of darkness. I felt something cold wrap around my right leg, just below my knee. The pain was, I can't even describe it, like ice and fire at the same time. I screamed and fell backward, hitting the ground hard. Through tears, I saw more shadow things moving between the trees, all making different sounds. Dogs barking, Tom calling for help, Sarah screaming. I don't remember pulling out my flare gun. I just remember firing it straight at the thing holding my leg. The red light burst like a tiny sun, and the shadow thing let go with a sound like wind through dead trees. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard real footsteps running toward me, real voices shouting my name. Kate, we heard screaming. It was Tom and Sarah, finally arriving with their own flashlights blazing. The flare was still burning, keeping the shadow things back. Tom and Sarah grabbed me under my arms and started dragging me away. I tried to tell them about Max, tried to make them go look for him, but the pain in my leg was too much. Everything started going dark. The last thing I remember was looking back over Tom's shoulder, seeing all those symbols glowing softly in the flare's dying light, and hearing Max whimper one last time. But not from my Max. Never from my Max again. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, but they couldn't save my right leg below the knee. Where that shadow thing had grabbed me, the flesh had turned black, like it had been frozen solid. They had to amputate. Tom and Sarah visited me every day. They told me they'd searched for Max and the Cooper family for weeks. They never found them, never found any trace of them at all. The only thing left at the campsite was that half-cooked pot of pasta, now covered in mold. I spent 2 months in the hospital learning to walk with a prosthetic leg. The whole time I kept telling myself it was over, that whatever happened in those woods was behind me. I was wrong. It started the night I finally came home to my cabin. I was sitting in my living room, trying to get used to the quiet house without Max around, when I heard scratching at my front door. Not loud, just gentle, like a dog asking to be let in. Max used to do that all the time. I knew better than to open the door. The scratching continued all night. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, then start again. Around midnight, I heard whimpering. Perfect copies of all the different dogs that had gone missing over the years. Each one distinct, each one sounding so real and so scared. But the worst part came 3 days later. I was cleaning out my spare room, the one where I used to keep Max extra stuff, when I found them. In the back of the closet was a pile of dog collars, dozens of them, some old and weathered, some new. The Cooper family's golden retriever's collar was there, and Max's collar too, the one with the little silver badge he'd gotten for 5 years of rescue service. They were all warm to the touch, like they'd just been taken off. I still live here in my cabin. Had to. Couldn't afford to move after all the hospital bills. Every few months, I hear the scratching again. Sometimes it's at my door, sometimes my windows. Always followed by the whimpering, the perfect copies of lost pets calling out to be let in. The rangers put up warning signs in that part of the forest. Dangerous wildlife area, no pets allowed. It's not exactly a lie, I guess. We never did find the Cooper family, but sometimes on really quiet nights, I hear their voices too, calling out from the woods behind my cabin. I've learned to live with the prosthetic leg, learned to live with the nightmares, but I'll never forget what I saw that night or what it cost me. And I'll never forgive myself for not being able to save Max. Just last week, Jenny from the office called me. Another emergency beacon had gone off in the same area. She wanted to know if I'd help with the search, since I know that part of the woods so well. I told her to tell the other rangers one thing. If they hear dogs barking out there, or people calling for help, don't follow the sounds. No matter how real they seem, no matter how much it hurts to ignore them. Because whatever's out there in Blackwood Forest, it's still hunting, still waiting, and it can sound like anything, or anyone, it wants to. Sometimes I wonder if it sounds like me now too. My name is Alex Cooper, and this happened to me last winter. I still have nightmares about it, but people need to know the truth about what we found in the ice. I've been studying climate change for 15 years. Most of my work involves checking how fast ice is melting in cold places. Think of it like being an ice detective. Usually, it's pretty straightforward. We measure things, take samples, and write reports. But what happened in Siberia changed everything. It started when my team and I set up our research station near a huge frozen lake. Picture a bunch of fancy trailers sitting on endless white snow with mountains in the distance. There were 6 of us at first. Me, Sarah, who's amazing at studying tiny things under microscopes. Marcus, who knows everything about ancient creatures. James, our expert on weird life forms. And 2 research assistants, Tom and Lisa. The local people, the Yakut, kept telling us to leave that area alone. The ice keeps the bad spirits trapped, they said. I remember smiling politely when they told us this. I'm a scientist. I don't believe in spirits. Well, I didn't used to anyway. Everything was normal for the first few weeks. We drilled ice cores, long tubes of ice that tell us about the past, took measurements, and did our usual science stuff. Then our equipment started picking up something strange, a warm spot deep in the ice where nothing should be warm. This can't be right, Sarah said one morning, squinting at her computer screen. Something down there is giving off heat. We were excited at first. Maybe we'd found something new, a special kind of bacteria or some chemical reaction we didn't know about. That's what we thought. That's what we hoped. We had no idea we were about to uncover something that had been frozen on purpose, something our ancestors had trapped in the ice for a very good reason, something that should have stayed frozen forever. Looking back, I should have listened to those warnings, but I was too curious, too eager to make a big discovery. And by the time we realized what we'd done, it was already starting to wake up. I still remember the day we first saw it in the ice. It looked like dark threads or roots spreading through the frozen ground, but somehow alive. And as we watched, it seemed to notice us too. That's when everything started to go wrong. The first weird things we noticed weren't about the black stuff in the ice at all. It was about the animals. Arctic foxes usually stay away from humans, but one morning I saw 3 of them standing completely still outside our station windows. They weren't moving at all, just staring at our research site for hours. No normal fox does that. Hey, come look at this, I called to Sarah, who was making coffee. Something's not right with these foxes. But it got stranger. Later that day, we saw a flock of birds flying over our station. Suddenly, they all dropped from the sky at the exact same time, like someone had flipped a switch. Before we could even react, they all got up and flew away together, moving like they were connected by invisible strings. That's impossible, Marcus whispered, his breath making little clouds in the cold air. Birds don't act like that. We should have packed up right then. We should have called for help. But we were scientists, and we wanted to understand. That was our first big mistake. James was working late one night, studying the samples we'd taken from the ice. He'd been complaining about headaches all day, but we didn't think much of it. Looking through microscopes for hours can do that to you. But when I went to check on him, I froze in the doorway. He was standing perfectly still, like those foxes had been, staring at the black stuff we'd pulled from the ice. When he turned to look at me, his eyes, something was different about them. They had this weird shine, like oil on water. Alex, he said, but his voice sounded wrong, like 2 people talking at once. You need to see this. It's beautiful. I backed away slowly. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Because right then, I realized 2 terrifying things. Whatever was in that ice wasn't just some ancient frozen creature. It was awake, and it was spreading. I ran to the communications room to call for emergency evacuation, but when I got there, I found Sarah already there. She was standing in front of the radio equipment, which had been completely taken apart. When she turned around, I saw that same shiny look in her eyes. We can't let you do that, Alex, she said softly. It needs time to grow, to spread, to make us better. I slammed the door and locked it from the outside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. Through the window, I could see Sarah smiling at me. Not her normal smile, but something else, something hungry. Out of our team of 6, only Tom, Lisa, and I were still ourselves. And we were trapped in our own research station, surrounded by the endless Arctic winter, with no way to call for help. And outside, in the constant darkness of the polar night, more foxes were gathering, waiting. watching, with eyes that shined just like James and Sarah's, Tom, Lisa, and I locked ourselves in the main lab. We had some food, water, and most importantly, our research samples. While we could hear the others moving around outside, we worked nonstop to figure out what was happening to our friends. Look at this, Lisa whispered, pointing to the microscope. We were studying blood samples from a dead fox we'd found earlier. The black stuff, it's moving through the blood cells, like it's changing them. That's when it hit me. It's the blood, I said, my voice shaking. That's how it spreads. The thing in the ice, it needs blood to take over. Just then, we heard a soft knock on the door. It was Marcus. We just want to talk, Alex, he said in that strange double voice they all had now. Don't you want to be part of something bigger, something better? I watched through the small window as more of them gathered in the hallway. They moved together, like dancers in a creepy ballet. Even their breathing was in sync. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just controlling them, it was connecting them like a web. We need to get out of here, Tom said, looking at our dwindling food supply. But they're everywhere. I stared out the window at the frozen lake next to our station, the same lake where we first found the black stuff in the ice. That's when I remembered something important from our early research. The thing in the ice had been frozen for thousands of years, and that's what had kept it asleep. The cold, I whispered. That's its weakness. That's why it was trapped here. We had liquid nitrogen in the station, the really, really cold stuff we used to preserve samples. And we had the lake. A plan started forming in my mind, but it was dangerous, really dangerous. I have an idea, I told Tom and Lisa, but you're not going to like it. We spent the next hour preparing. We put on our warmest gear and gathered every tank of liquid nitrogen we could find. The whole time, we could hear the others talking outside our door, trying to convince us to join them. Their voices were getting more desperate, more angry. They're breaking through, Lisa shouted. The door was starting to crack. I looked at my two remaining friends. Remember the plan, I said. No matter what happens, we have to get them onto the lake. The door burst open. And that's when our real fight for survival began. Everything happened so fast after they broke in. Our infected friends moved like one person, their shiny eyes all fixed on us. But we had a plan, and we stuck to it. Now, I screamed, and Tom threw the smoke grenades we found in our emergency kit. The room filled with thick white smoke. In the confusion, we ran, straight for the lake entrance. The cold hit me like a wall when we got outside. It was maybe minus 40 degrees, and the wind felt like knives on my face. But we kept running, our boots crunching in the snow. I looked back and saw them all following us, moving together like a wave. That's when things went wrong. Lisa slipped on the ice and fell. Before Tom could reach her, Sarah and James grabbed her. I watched in horror as a drop of blood from Lisa's cut hand touched Sarah's skin. Keep going, Lisa shouted at us, her eyes already starting to get that weird shine. Don't let me stop you. Tom and I made it to the middle of the lake. The ice was thick here, thick enough to hold us all. I pulled out the remote control for the liquid nitrogen tanks we set up earlier. My fingers were so cold I could barely press the buttons. They're coming, Tom whispered. And they were. All of them, Sarah, James, Marcus, Lisa, and even the foxes and birds. They surrounded us on the ice in a perfect circle. Their movements were smooth now, practiced, like they'd been doing this forever. You can't stop evolution, Alex, they said together, their voices mixing into one creepy sound. Join us. Be part of something greater. I'm sorry, I whispered, mostly to myself. Then I pressed the button. The liquid nitrogen tanks exploded exactly like we planned, sending waves of super cold gas across the lake. The temperature dropped so fast that the air itself seemed to freeze. I saw our infected friends try to run, but it was too late. The cold caught them all. Tom pushed me toward the shore just as the ice started cracking. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back when I heard the splashing, not looking back when the screaming stopped. I made it to the emergency shelter alone. Later, when help finally came, I told them everything. About the thing in the ice, about what happened to my friends, about how the ancient cold was the only thing that could stop it. They froze the whole lake again, deeper this time. Put up warning signs, posted guards. But sometimes late at night, I think about what's down there under the ice. I think about how the world is getting warmer every year, and I wonder if maybe, just maybe, those shiny eyes are watching, waiting for another chance. Because the scariest part, we never found all of the black stuff from the ice cores. And the thing about evolution it learns, it adapts, it waits. So if you're ever up in the Arctic and you see something dark moving under the ice or animals acting too perfect, too synchronized, run. Run as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't let it get in your blood. My name is Tom Walsh, and this happened to me back in 1973 when I was working as a Forest Service ranger in the Pacific Northwest. I spent 30 years protecting our forest, but what I saw that summer still gives me nightmares. Sometimes when I'm trying to sleep, I can still hear the sounds from the treetops, still smell that strange, sweet rot that covered everything. But I should start from the beginning. It was early June when we first got reports of illegal logging in the Red Pine area. Now, illegal logging wasn't unusual. There were always people trying to make quick money by cutting down trees they shouldn't. But this was different. The reports came from hikers who said they heard chainsaws at night, which was strange because nobody in their right mind cuts trees in the dark. I remember sitting at my desk, looking at the map of Red Pine. It was one of our oldest forests, with trees so tall they seemed to touch the clouds. Some of those giants had been growing for hundreds of years. As the senior ranger, it was my job to check it out. I put together a small team, just me and 3 other rangers, Mike, Sarah, and Dave. We were all experienced, all knew these woods like the backs of our hands. At least we thought we did. None of us could have guessed what was really waiting for us in there. The morning we headed out was perfect, sunny, cool, with just a light breeze rustling through the leaves. I remember thinking it was going to be a routine investigation. Just find the loggers, write them up, confiscate their equipment, maybe spend a night or 2 camping out if we had to. God, I was wrong. So wrong. And by the time we realized what we were really dealing with, it was already too late. We'd hiked for about 3 hours before we found the first signs of trouble. The loggers had cut a rough path through the forest, wide enough for their trucks, but something felt off. The air was too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrels chattering. Just the sound of our boots on the ground and our own breathing. Then we found their equipment, 2 big chainsaws, a pickup truck, and some axes, all left behind like someone had dropped everything and run. But that wasn't the weird part. Everything, and I mean everything, was covered in some kind of growth. It looked like moss, but wrong somehow. It was dark green with tiny purple spots, and it seemed to pulse slightly if you looked at it too long. Don't touch it, I told my team, though Sarah had already reached for one of the chainsaws. The growth had spread all over the metal and even eaten into the rubber handles. I'd worked in forests my whole life and had never seen anything like it. Dave, who used to teach biology before joining the Forest Service, took some pictures. This isn't normal, he said, his voice shaky. Moss doesn't grow this fast. These tools couldn't have been here more than a few days. We set up camp nearby, though none of us really wanted to stay close to that stuff. As the sun started to set, the forest got darker than usual. The trees seemed to crowd in around us, their branches blocking out what little light was left. That's when we heard it for the first time, a sound from high up in the trees. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I knew. It was like something heavy moving through the branches, but trying to be quiet about it. Mike saw it first. Tom. He whispered, pointing up. Something's moving up there. We'd all looked up, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I saw something slide behind a trunk, something big. But that was impossible. Nothing that big could climb trees. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. None of us slept much that night. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every little sound. By morning, that strange growth had spread another 6 feet from where we first saw it. And worse, we found fresh tracks in the dirt. They looked like tree roots had somehow dragged themselves across the ground. I wanted to radio for backup, but our equipment wasn't working, just static. We were on our own, and something in my gut told me we were in serious trouble. Sarah disappeared first. She was only gone for 5 minutes, just went to get water from the stream. When she didn't come back, we all started calling her name. That's when we heard her scream. We ran toward the sound, our boots pounding against the dirt. We found her water bottle by the stream, but no Sarah. Just a long streak of blood on the ground, like something had dragged her away. And next to the blood, more of those moving root marks. "We need to get out of here now," Mike said, his voice shaking. But as we turned to head back to camp, we realized something terrible. The trees looked different. Not a single one of us could remember which way we come from. That's when Dave figured it out. "The roots," he whispered, pointing at the ground. "They're all connected underground. Whatever that thing is, it's using the roots like a network, like a spider web, and we're the flies." He was right. The thing hunting us wasn't just in the trees. It was the trees, or something that had taken them over. We could see the roots moving now, ever so slightly, like fingers trying to grab us. Night was coming, and we were getting desperate. We tried climbing a slope to get our bearings, but the ground was soft and strange. Twice, roots burst out of the dirt, trying to wrap around our ankles. Mike cut one with his knife. It blew a dark, sticky sap and made a sound like a hurt animal. Then we heard Sarah's voice, calling from somewhere in the darkness. "Help, I'm over here." But it didn't sound quite right, like someone or something was trying to copy her voice. "Don't answer it," I told the others. "That's not Sarah." We huddled together as the sun set, backs against a big rock where no roots could get us from behind. The sounds in the canopy were louder now. Whatever was up there wasn't trying to hide anymore. Branches swayed and cracked without any wind. That night, we lost Dave too. Something reached down from above. I only saw it for a second in my flashlight beam. It looked like a branch, but it moved like an arm. One moment Dave was there. The next he was gone, pulled up into the darkness. All we heard was a muffled scream and then nothing. Mike grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Tom," he said, pointing at the trees around us. "Look at the trunks." I shined my light where he was pointing. That strange growth we'd seen on the logging equipment, it was spreading up the tree trunks. But now I could see what it really was. Not moss or fungus, but something alive, something hungry. And it was spreading faster by the minute. Mike and I ran. We didn't care about direction anymore. We just ran. But the forest was changing around us. The strange growth was everywhere now, making the trees look sick and wrong. Their bark was peeling off, showing something dark and wet underneath. Then I remembered something important, something from my 20 years of forest work that might save us. Every spring, we did controlled burns to keep the forest healthy. And there was one thing all that weird growth reminded me of. It was spreading like fire, but backwards. Instead of burning things up, it was taking them over. "Mike," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Fire. That's how we fight it." But before Mike could answer, a root shot up from the ground between us. It wrapped around his leg like a snake. I grabbed his hand, pulling as hard as I could, but more roots came up. They were dragging him down into the dirt. "Tom," he screamed. "Burn it. Burn it all." Those were his last words before the ground swallowed him up. I ran again, tears streaming down my face. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I had to make it back to our camp. We had emergency flares there and matches, and most importantly, the radio. Maybe it would work now. Maybe I could warn people. The thing in the trees was following me. I could hear it moving overhead, branches cracking under its weight. Sometimes I caught glimpses of it, like a huge shadow made of twisted wood and that awful growth, flowing from tree to tree. Finally, I saw our tent through the trees. It was covered in the growth now, but my backpack was still inside. I dug for it, grabbed the flares and my lighter. The radio was dead, just static and a weird wet sound, like something was growing inside it. That's when I realized the truth. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just killing people, it was spreading. If it reached the edge of the forest, reached other trees, it would never stop. It would take over everything. I had only one choice. The forest was dry from summer heat. A fire would spread fast, maybe fast enough to kill this thing before it could escape. But setting a fire this big meant breaking every rule I'd learned in my career. It meant probably dying here. Looking up at the thing moving in the branches, seeing that horrible growth spreading everywhere, I knew what I had to do. I thought about Sarah, Mike, and Dave, about their families waiting at home, about all the other forests this thing could infect. I took out my lighter and the emergency flares. The thing in the tree sensed what I was about to do. It started moving faster, reaching down with its branch-like arms. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't running anymore. I lit the first flare and threw it into a patch of dry leaves. The thing in the tree screamed, a sound like wood splitting and wind howling all mixed together. I lit another flare and threw it in the opposite direction. The fire caught fast, just like I knew it would. The roots started bursting out of the ground all around me, trying to grab me, but I kept moving, lighting more fires. The heat was intense and smoke filled the air. But I had to make sure the fire made a complete circle. Had to trap this thing here. Above me, the creature was going crazy. It swung from tree to tree, its wooden limbs reaching for me. The strange growth was falling off it like rain, trying to spread faster than the fire could burn, but fire was winning. I could hear the trees crackling as they caught flame. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe. Part of me wanted to run, to try to save myself, but I knew I couldn't. Someone had to make sure the fire stayed controlled, didn't spread to the whole forest, and someone had to make sure that thing died here. The creature dropped down right in front of me. In the firelight, I finally saw it clearly. It looked like 100 trees had twisted themselves together into something almost human-shaped, covered in that awful growing stuff. Where a face should be, there was just more of that pulsing growth. "This end is here," I told it, my voice rough from the smoke. I lit my last flare. It reached for me with arms made of twisted branches. I threw the flare right at it. The thing caught fire immediately, the growth on it burning bright purple. Its scream this time was different, desperate, dying. The fire was everywhere now. I backed up against a big rock, watching as the creature thrashed and burned. The growth was shriveling up in the heat, turning black and falling away. The roots stopped moving. My eyes were stinging, and I could barely breathe, but I felt peaceful somehow. I'd done my job, protected the forest, even if it meant destroying part of it, protected everyone beyond it. The fire would burn itself out against the rocks and streams I'd used as boundaries. The forest would grow back eventually, clean and healthy. As the smoke got thicker, I thought about all my years as a forest ranger, about all the trees I protected. Funny how, in the end, I had to burn some to save the rest. The last thing I saw was the creature collapsing, its wooden body breaking apart in the flames. The last thing I heard was the regular sound of a forest fire. No more screams, no more moving roots. Just the clean, purifying sound of flames doing their natural work. They found my body 2 days later, after the fire burned out. Just like I planned, it hadn't spread beyond the red pine area. They probably thought I died trying to stop the illegal loggers who started a fire. That's okay. Who'd believe the real story anyway? But if you're ever in the forest and you see something strange growing on the trees, something that doesn't look quite right, don't wait. Don't try to study it. Just run. Run as fast as you can. Because sometimes the only way to save a forest is to burn it. I learned that the hard way. My name is Maria Santos, and this happened to me back in 1988 when I was working as a marine biologist. Even now, 36 years later, my hands shake when I think about what we found in Lake Blackwood. I'd spent 15 years studying lakes and oceans, looking at how pollution affects fish and other water creatures. It was a normal job, the kind where you wear a white coat, look at water samples under microscopes, and write lots of notes. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. At least, that's what I thought until Lake Blackwood changed everything. It started with a simple assignment. The government wanted someone to check out Lake Blackwood because factories nearby were dumping their waste into it. They picked me to lead a small team, 5 other scientists who would help me collect samples and run tests. The lake looked normal enough when we first got there. It sat between tall pine trees, with mountains in the background and a foggy mist that usually hum over the water in the mornings. We had a little research station right on the shore, Basically, a big metal building with our labs inside and a long wooden dock stretching out over the water. My team was good at their jobs. Tom Parker was my assistant, smart, careful, always double checking everything. Sarah Chen was our youngest member, fresh out of college and excited about her first big project. Dr. James Wright knew everything about underwater sounds. If something made a noise in that lake, he could tell you what it was, or at least he used to be able to. I remember sitting in my office that first week, looking out at the dark water, thinking how peaceful it all seemed. If only I'd known what was hiding under that calm surface. If only I'd noticed the signs earlier. But I didn't. None of us did. Not until we started finding the fish, the strange, twisted fish that shouldn't exist. That's when our peaceful research project turned into a nightmare. I'm telling this story now because people need to know the truth about what happened at Lake Blackwood, about what we created with our careless dumping of chemicals and waste, about what might still be down there, growing stronger, waiting. Let me start at the beginning, with the first warning signs that something was very, very wrong with our lake. The trouble began on a chilly October morning. I was checking our water test, the kind we did every day, when Tom rushed into my office. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Dr. Santos, Maria, you need to see this," he said, holding up a glass jar. Inside was a fish, but not like any fish I'd ever seen before. It was a carp, the kind that normally eats plants and tiny creatures in the lake. But this one was wrong. So wrong, it was nearly twice as big as it should have been, and its mouth, instead of the usual flat fish lips, it had sharp, pointed teeth like a shark's. Its eyes were the creepiest part. They were huge and milky white, like something you'd see on a deep-sea creature that lives where sunlight never reaches. "Where did you find it?" I asked, taking the jar with trembling hands. "Near the North Shore," Tom said. "There are more, Maria, a lot more." We spent the next few days collecting more fish. Each one was stranger than the last. Some had extra fins, others had scales that seemed to glow in the dark. Sarah started keeping a chart on the wall, marking where we found each one. The dots on her map kept spreading like the weirdness was moving through the lake. At night, things got even stranger. The first time we heard it, we were all working late in the lab. It was a sound that made us freeze, like a deep rumble coming from the lake, but not like any boat or normal lake noise. Dr. Wright, our sound expert, looked worried. "That's not possible," he kept saying, staring at his sound equipment. "Nothing in a lake should be able to make that kind of noise." But it did, and it got louder. We started noticing other things too. Our equipment would go crazy at night, showing something big moving through the water. Whatever it was far bigger than any fish that should be in Lake Blackwood. Sometimes, when we looked out the windows after dark, we'd see the water moving in ways it shouldn't, like something massive was swimming just beneath the surface. One evening, Sarah stayed late to check some water samples. I was in my office when I heard her scream. By the time we got to the dock, there was nothing there except her broken flashlight floating in the water. The police came, but they couldn't find anything. They said she probably fell in and drowned. But I knew better. We all did, because just before we heard her scream, the water sensors had gone crazy, showing something huge moving right under the dock. That's when we realized we weren't just dealing with pollution-killing fish anymore. Something was alive in Lake Blackwood. Something big. Something hungry. And somehow, our pollution, our chemicals, had helped create it. If only that had been the end of it. But it was just the beginning of our nightmare. After Sarah disappeared, most people would have packed up and left. Maybe we should have. But we were scientists, and we needed to understand what was happening. Looking back, our curiosity nearly got us all killed. The police closed the lake to swimmers and boats, but that didn't stop whatever was in there. A week later, 2 fishermen went missing. Their boat washed up on shore the next morning. When we looked at it, my heart nearly stopped. There were huge bite marks on the bottom, bigger than anything the normal lake creature could make. Dr. Wright spent hours listening to his underwater microphones trying to track the thing. "It's smart," he told me one night, his face lit by computer screens. "It stays deep during the day, but at night, it comes up to hunt." That's when we noticed something odd. The creatures seemed to show up most often near our electrical equipment. The dock lights, our boat's motors, even the underwater cameras we used to study the lake. One night, I was looking at more of our mutated fish samples when it hit me. Their bodies had changed to detect electrical signals, like sharks do. That's how they found their food in the dark water, and if the small fish had changed this way. The big one must be able to sense electricity too, I told Tom. That's how it hunts. It follows the electrical signals from boats, equipment, even people swimming. We had to test our theory, but Dr. Wright got there first. He went down to the underwater observation room, a small glass bubble beneath our dock where we could watch fish. The room had lots of electrical equipment, lights, and cameras. Perfect bait. I was in my office when the alarms went off. By the time we got to the dock, the observation room's thick glass was shattered. The security camera caught it all, something pale and enormous coming out of the darkness, drawn to all that electrical equipment. And Dr. Wright. We found pieces of the camera floating in the water, all the recording, just before it went dark. We saw it clearly for the first time. It was like a giant eel, but wrong, mutated like the fish we found. It had to be at least 40 feet long, with pale, almost glowing skin and rows of teeth that looked like huge needles. Tom started packing up that night. We need to leave, he said. Call the army or something. But I couldn't. You see, we found something even worse in our latest tests. There were eggs, hundreds of them, hidden in the deepest parts of the lake. Whatever this thing was, it was breeding. Soon there would be more. That's when I knew what we had to do. It was dangerous, probably crazy, but it was our only choice. We had to stop this thing before it could lay more eggs, before its babies could grow up and spread to other lakes and rivers. I have a plan, I told Tom, looking out at the dark water. But you're not going to like it. I didn't like it either. But when you're facing a monster that you helped create, sometimes crazy plans are all you have left. My plan was simple but dangerous. If the creature was attracted to electrical power, we'd give it the biggest electrical shock it had ever felt. We had a research boat loaded with equipment, perfect bait for our trap. We'll wire the whole boat with powerful electrical cables, I explained to Tom. When the creature attacks, we'll send enough electricity through the water to stun or kill it. Tom looked at me like I was crazy. That's suicide. Who's going to be on the boat? No one, I said. We'll control it from shore. But someone has to get close enough to flip the switch at the right moment. That night was darker than usual. No moon, no stars. Just thick clouds making everything black. Our boat sat in the middle of the lake, all its lights blazing, equipment humming. The perfect target. We didn't have to wait long. First came the ripples, small waves moving against the wind. Then our sensors started beeping like crazy. Something big was coming up from the deep. Get ready, I whispered to Tom, my hand on the power switch. The creature broke the surface next to our boat, and for the first time, we saw it completely. I'll never forget that sight. It was like a giant eel, but twisted and wrong. Its skin was almost white, glowing faintly in the dark. Its head was massive, with eyes the size of dinner plates, completely white like the mutated fish we found. Rows of teeth lined its mouth, each one as long as my arm. It rose up, towering over our boat, water streaming off its massive body. The boat looked like a toy next to it. Now, Tom screamed. I slammed down the switch. The lake lit up like daytime. Blue-white electricity arced across the water. The creature screamed. I still hear it in my nightmares. It was part roar, part screech, like nothing on earth should make. The light show lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like forever. When it was over, our boat was gone, and the lake was quiet, too quiet. We searched for days, but never found the creature's body. The official report called it an industrial accident. The government cleaned up the lake, or said they did. They shut down the factories that had polluted the water. Only Tom and I know the whole truth. We're the only ones left. Sometimes I get calls from people who live near Lake Blackwood. They tell me about strange movements in the water at night, about fish acting weird, about deep sounds coming from the lake that make their dogs howl. I tell them to stay away from the water after dark, to keep their boats off the lake, because deep down, I know the truth. We didn't kill it that night. Maybe we made it stronger, Maybe it's still down there in the darkest depths waiting. And worse, what if those eggs we found had already hatched? Even now, 36 years later, I won't go near any lake because I know what humans can create when we poison nature. I know what might be hiding under those calm waters, groaning, changing, waiting for the lights to come on after dark. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder, did we really solve the problem that night, or did we just make it angry?